packing in more entertainment than an entire season of Downton Abbey, but slightly less controversy than an episode of Jerry Springer. It's episode 3 of World of Stu. Hi, I'm Stuart Grant and I'm back once again with the third episode of World of Stu. This time round we are going to be looking at a topic that is so huge and so monumental that we are going to have to split it over 2 shows to do it justice. But before we get to that, I just wanted to take a quick look back at episode 2 and a correction, because I am not above correcting myself when I am wrong. In episode 2, we talked about TV networks and the shows that they cancel and the shows that they, shouldn't cancel and the ones that they should. And I was talking about Lost, and I stated that it ran for 4 seasons when actually it ran for 6, which is even more depressing because that means I wasted 6 years of my life watching it rather than 4, and it should have stopped after 2. But that's besides the point. I stand corrected. It was 6 seasons, not 4. But let's not dwell on the past. Let's look forward to the future. So episode 3 is here, and this go around we are starting our look at the MCU. Now, for the uninitiated amongst you, the MCU is the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And believe it or not, and this is kind of difficult to grasp really, based in the comic book centric world of movies that we currently live in, but there was a time when there was no Marvel Cinematic Universe. Back in the day, Marvel, who are obviously one of the 2 biggest comic book companies in the world, the other being DC, Marvel concentrated on comics and cartoons. It was what brought them to the dance. It's what they did particularly well. There was no movies, they didn't have to worry about that. Times were hard, and they had to sell some of the rights to the movie rights, I should say, to some of their characters. So it's a bit confusing because they still owned the rights to their characters in terms of comic books and cartoons, but when it came to being able to make movies of these characters, they no longer owned the rights because they needed some money, so they sold the movie rights on. I guess they probably thought that if anyone ever made a movie of Spider-Man or Hulk, that it wouldn't be very good based on previous experiences of making films for those characters. So anyway, they sold Spider-Man and Ghost Rider to Sony. Fox got the X-Men, Daredevil and the Fantastic Four. Artisan bought Iron Man, Captain America and Thor. And Universal got their grubby little mitts on Hulk and Namor, who is the Submariner, for those of you who don't know who Namor is. So I guess we skip forward a few years. The rights are just floating around. No one's really doing anything with it until we get to the year 2000. And that is when Fox decided to release the first X-Men film. It was a gamble, obviously, because comic book movies were kind of dead in the water after what Joel Schumacher did with the Batman franchise. But anyway, they released the first X-Men film, which took $296 million at the box office off a budget of just $75 million. So obviously it was quite a big hit. Comic book fans loved it, and the everyday normal cinema going crowd loved it as well. So this obviously showed that there was an appetite for comic book movies. So after the X-Men film came out in 2000, we waited 2 more years, and Sony decided to jump on the bandwagon in 2002 with the first of their 3 Spider-Man movies. And when I say obviously there's been technically 5 Spider-Man movies now, but we'll concentrate for the time being on the fact that Sony had an original trilogy of 3 Spider-Man films, first of which came out in 2002 and blew the box office apart. $821 million it took off a budget of just $140 million. So this kind of opened the floodgates a little bit, to be honest. Over the next 5 years, there were a number of Marvel-based superhero movies, none of which actually were done by Marvel, because again, they didn't own the rights to the characters. But over the next 5 years, so up until 2008, they ranged from the excellent with X2, which was the second X-Men film, and Spider-Man 2, Sony's follow-up to the original Spider-Man. They ranged from those to the good, Blade Trinity and Hulk, although I know some of you will disagree with Hulk, but we'll get to that shortly, to the very poor Elektra, Ghost Rider starring Nicolas Cage. Now, whoever thought Nicolas Cage would ever have made a good Superman, because there was a time when he almost played Superman, I will never ever know what the thought process was there. But after he destroyed Ghost Rider, hopefully he will never be near another superhero franchise in his life. And also a very poor film was X-Men The Last Stand, which was the third, and at the time we thought final, entry into the X-Men trilogy, and it was pretty terrible. It starred Vinnie Jones as Juggernaut. That's all you really need to know. So as all of this was going on, obviously Marvel are sat on the sidelines looking in from the outside, thinking, we created these characters, you're making all the money off of it, we should be doing something with the characters that we actually own. So into the ring they threw their hat with the release of their first entry into what would become the Marvel Cinematic Universe, 2008's Iron Man. Now obviously at the time it was a gamble, would people want to see Iron Man? He's not one of the most well-known or popular characters. You certainly know Batman or Superman or Hulk or Spider-Man, but they had to start somewhere. Anyway, Iron Man took $585 million at the box office off of a budget of $140 million, so it wasn't as successful as the initial Spider-Man film, but was good enough for them to think, maybe we're onto something here, maybe we should be making more of these films. Now, quite when the thought process went from making individual movies into the collective franchise that would become the MCU, when that decision was taken is unclear, although they will probably argue that it was always in their mind that they were going to do that. But anyway, around this time as well, I have good news for Marvel. They had reclaimed the rights to some of the characters, one of which was Hulk. Now, we already made reference to the fact that in 2003 there was a Hulk film which had nothing to do with Marvel. It was directed by Ang Lee. And the reason why I wanted to have a quick discussion about this film is that most people tend to slate it, saying it's not very good, it's too melodramatic, it should be all about Hulk smashing stuff, and, we don't need all the drama of, the television show back in the 70s with Bill Bixby playing David Banner, not Bruce Banner, and Lou Ferrigno painting himself green and being the Hulk. Obviously there was a lot of melodrama there with David Banner wandering around all forlorn and a bit like the Littlest Hobo. If you remember the Littlest Hobo, you'll get that reference. I personally liked Ang Lee's Hulk. It took $245 million off a budget of $137 million, so it wasn't bad, but it was considered a flop commercially and creatively. People didn't like it. I thought Eric Banner, not Banner, but Banner, played Bruce Banner really well, and I thought that the CGI with the Hulk, when he was the Hulk, was great. I should put a caveat on that it's only when the CGI is in daylight that it looks great. There's too many scenes, this is one of the problems with the film, too many scenes where the CGI action takes place in the dark. And I remember going to see Hulk at the cinema, and I actually strained to see what was going on with the spoilers coming, by the way, where he's fighting the giant mutant dogs, and also the final battle where he's fighting his dad. Speaking of the father, that is probably the one major problem with Ang Lee's Hulk, is this whole crazy relationship thing he's got going on with his dad, and his dad suddenly has all these powers, and then there's this big battle at the end. Fairly terrible. The whole father thread throughout the story and the final battle were pretty bad, but I still do not believe that Ang Lee's Hulk deserves the hate that it gets. Anyway, it bombed, so Universal did nothing with the character, which meant that the rights could revert back to Marvel, and therefore the second step in what would become the MCU was an Incredible Hulk film. Again, I don't know what it is about the character of the Hulk, but it wasn't well received. Edward Norton took over from Eric Banner, and he played Bruce Banner. Film took less than about the same as the first one, actually, $263 million against a budget of $150. When you actually talk about the MCU now, not many people actually reference the Incredible Hulk. It's almost like an afterthought that never happened. Personally, I thought Edward Norton again was great as Bruce Banner, but he turned down the opportunity to play the role again. And aside from the obligatory post-credit scene, which featured Robert Downey Jr.'s Iron Man making reference to the Avengers Initiative, you'd be hard-pressed to see any connection between the Incredible Hulk movie and the MCU overall, purely because it didn't go down particularly well and Norton wasn't involved, and like I say, other than that short post-credit scene, there's no real reference to the bigger picture. I thought it was a great comic book movie that suffered from some of the same problems as the first Hulk film by Ang Lee, in that the end battle was pretty bad. This time he was fighting the Abomination. It's probably one of Tim Roth, actually, who played the character turned into the Abomination. Probably one of his worst performances in a film, but I don't think it detracts from the overall feel of the Incredible Hulk, and I enjoyed it. But then I'm a comic book geek, and it'd take a lot for me to not enjoy a film, despite the fact that I do critique them and I am incredibly picky about the smaller details. So the Incredible Hulk was a misstep, and even at that point, you've had Iron Man, you've had the Incredible Hulk, there's no indication that there's going to be a massive big picture deal going on with the MCU, where you're going to have all these different characters and you're going to pull in threads from all the different films and create an overall painting of a bigger picture. That was until Disney came a knocking on Marvel's door in 2009, and they paid a staggering $4 billion to buy Marvel as a company, which meant that they now own the comic books and they now own the movie rights, again only to the characters that Marvel owned the movie rights to at that time. I don't know why Disney decided to do this. It would appear that it's a part of their apparent plan to own the entertainment world, because they've also bought Pixar in 2006 for $7.4 billion, which makes Pixar more valuable than Marvel. They bought the Muppets in 2004 for $75 million, a bargain if you ask me, and most famously for some of my Star Wars loving friends, in 2012 they bought the rights to Star Wars and Lucasfilm for $4.06 billion. The figures are staggering, to be honest. So Marvel obviously now have new almighty, all-powerful Disney giving them the financial backing, and they were able to push ahead with their plans, and the grand scheme for the whole Marvel Cinematic Universe began to become clear. The MCU, when you actually look at it, is without doubt, and this is just my personal take on it, the most intricate and well thought out movie franchise of all time, especially when you consider that the larger big picture has been in place almost from day one. Unlike, say, for instance, Star Wars, where their trilogies, although they interconnect to a certain extent, when the original trilogy came out, there was no grand plan for a larger franchise where there would be other trilogies that would tie in. It was just a trilogy, still on its own, that was it. The MCU, almost from day one, has been all about this larger picture. And B, the films are not directly based on a series of novels, such as, for instance, Harry Potter or The Hunger Games. Yes, there is source material from the comic books, and there's decades and decades of stuff that they can reference, and they pull little bits from here and little bits from the Ultimate Universe and all the rest of it, but there's no specific storyline or thread in the comic books that they are following through and creating in their movies. They are taking little bits when they want, and they're picking and choosing, and they're making their own brand new storyline. Over the course of time, Marvel have made various announcements. It's normally at places like San Diego Comic-Con, which I would personally love to go to. The only problem with that is I am the Mr. T of my family, and that I ain't getting on no plane. And B, it's in America, which I have no real desire to visit. There's nothing against America or Americans, it's just not for me. So anyway, the sheer scale of the MCU became clear as they broke the whole thing down into what they have decided to call phases. So Iron Man and the Incredible Hulk that we were talking about before, they were the start of phase 1. And phase 3, or the third phase, which at the moment is looking like it is, temporarily anyway, the final phase. So maybe the end game is coming at the end of the third phase, will not finish until 2019 with the second half of the Avengers Infinity War, which is the third Avengers film, which is being split into two parts. So technically, I guess it's the third and the fourth Avengers film, but it's all one film. So horses for courses. You can call it the third, you can call it the fourth. That will actually be the 21st entry of the MCU in an 11-year period, which, if you read the World of Stu review page that I have on Facebook, I've done a post on there about the sheer scale and number of comic book movies that there are coming out in the next 6 or 7 years. I think it was, there's 25 movies coming out in the next 5 years, all just based on the comic book genre, because obviously DC are now trying to play catch up with Marvel, and they're trying to launch their own universe. But 25 movies in 5 years is pushing their luck a little bit. Even the most ardent comic book fans, I think, are going to struggle to maintain their enthusiasm for that many films. Going back though, because obviously we're skipping ahead and we're nowhere near phase 3 yet, we're only just finishing the end of phase 2. We need to go back to 2010 and the third Marvel film. This is still part of phase 1, and it was the first film after the Disney deal, obviously, and it was Iron Man 2. It seems that whenever they want to do something new and they want to relaunch it, because obviously after the Incredible Hulk bombs, they needed to, get back on track, they go back to Tony Stark. And why not? Because comic book fans love Tony Stark and everyone else loves Robert Downey Jr. So it seems like the perfect place to go. I'm going to assume that the decision was made to return to the adventures of Tony Stark to ascertain how much damage the Incredible Hulk had done. With Iron Man, like I say, it was a hit and people love Tony Stark and they love Robert Downey Jr. So if they hadn't have come in their droves to see Iron Man 2, that could have been the end of the MCU. Luckily for them, $623 million off of a $200 million budget is what it took at the box office. So things were back on track and the MCU was coming into full effect. Talking about Iron Man 2, as an action-packed comic book movie, it ticks all the right boxes as far as I'm concerned, but this is just my personal opinion, I don't believe it is deserving of the adulation that it gets. Yes, as I've just mentioned, Robert Downey Jr. continues to smash it in the lead role, but Mickey Rourke, for me, was a pretty weak villain, and I think he was probably only picked to be the villain in that film based off the back of the phenomenal success that he had in The Wrestler, which is another great film, but that's for another story for a different time. The action set pieces as well just felt too similar to what we had seen in the first Iron Man film. The final battle in the first Iron Man film was Iron Man versus a giant robot with his colleague or his boss or his friend from the company who's gone villainous and is backing the Five Rings dudes or whatever it is they're called, I forget off the top of my head, in the desert, and he wanted Tony dead. So it's Iron Man versus a giant robot. Iron Man 2 is just Iron Man plus War Machine versus an army of giant robots, which when you actually think about it is quite similar to the end of the latest Marvel Cinematic Universe entry, but we'll get to that when we get to that. So Iron Man 2 did brilliantly at the box office. I didn't think it was that great a film. In fact, I'm even going to go on record as saying I preferred The Incredible Hulk to Iron Man 2. But we jump forward to 2011 with the next two entries in phase 1 of the franchise, and we were introduced to Thor, who would also kind of battle it out with a giant robot. There seems to be a theme starting to develop here, but that took $449 million at the box office. And Captain America, who thankfully didn't fight a robot, that took $370 million at the box office. Both films I thought were great. Chris Hemsworth in Thor. Well, he was Thor, and Chris Evans, who was Captain America. Both characters felt as though they were in safe hands with those actors, so there was nothing to worry about there, and the future looked bright for those two particular characters as pertains to their individual films, as well as how they would deal with them in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Now, this is where they started to get clever and make things work towards that bigger picture that I've mentioned before, because throughout all of these films as they were being made, so Iron Man 2, Thor and Captain America, there was sort of similar common threads going through them that were all kind of linked together by the post-scenes credits, and they kept the characters grounded within the same universe. In Thor, a lot of the film was in Asgard, but he also spent time on Earth, and it was S.H.I.E.L.D. really that kept the whole thing together. So whilst each film could stand on their own, and if there was no bigger MCU, that would be fine, there was things in each film, such as Captain America's shield in Iron Man, and Thor's hammer was the post-credit scene at the end of either Iron Man or Iron Man 2. I'm going to say it was Iron Man 2, but I'm probably wrong, and you will, if I'm wrong, you can post comments underneath and you can tell me that I was wrong. But these little things gave us the idea that these characters all knew each other and that they all existed in one place at one time, which was unique, because up to that point, even when we'd had Superman films and we'd had Batman films, there had been no reference really to each other or the fact that other superheroes existed. I think it was in Batman Forever, or it may have been Batman and Robin, but I think it was Batman Forever. There was a couple of little references to Metropolis, which is obviously where Superman lives, also where Clark Kent works at the Daily Planet. But there was no, they didn't live in the same place. You didn't see them interact or anything like that. There was no common thread. They just lived in two completely separate universes, whereas the MCU was trying to bring everything together. Like I say, they also introduced the mid-credit and post-credit scenes, which would also tie the things together and would give us an idea of where they were going, despite the fact that this was 8 years before the final Avengers picture will be made. We start to see our first glimpses of Thanos, and we've seen more of Thanos. He obviously appears in Guardians of the Galaxy, and he is in the post-credit scene, and this is a spoiler coming up for you. He's in the post-credit scene of the Avengers 2, Age of Ultron. Whilst the MCU had to this point been a success, it wouldn't be until 2012 and the Avengers Assemble that it would truly explode and become the massive phenomenon that it is today. It basically forced its way down people's throats and into the public consciousness in the biggest way possible. Avengers Assemble cost $220 million to make, but at the box office it took a staggering and mind-boggling $1.5 billion. $1.5 billion at the box office. If there was ever any proof that you needed that superhero films were here in a big way and here to stay, then that was all the indication you were ever going to need. Avengers brought together Iron Man, it brought together Thor, and it brought together Captain America, and it also chucked in Black Widow, who we had seen throughout the films as a member of S.H.I.E.L.D., and Hawkeye. And I can't remember if we'd seen any Hawkeye previous to the Avengers film, but he was also a member of S.H.I.E.L.D. We brought back Hulk as a character in the MCU, although, as I've already said, there was no reference to his previous outing, and this time Edward Norton was gone, and Mark Ruffalo was brought into the role of Bruce Banner / the Hulk. To say it was an ambitious gambit would be an understatement, to be honest. To take characters from what were still in effect 3 separate film franchises, despite the overall arcing nature of the whole thing, and throw in others that were unproven was a risk, as far as I'm concerned. Yes, the earlier films have been successful, but would the average everyday layman accept all these characters being thrown together into a cohesive storyline? Some people might not have seen Thor, whereas they may have seen Captain America and Iron Man. They might not have watched Iron Man, they might have seen Captain America and Thor. So would everyone, yes, comic book fans would know who all the characters were and would be wetting themselves to get to the cinema to watch the Avengers assemble, but would everybody else agree? And that is where we are going to leave the first half of our look at the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. This half an hour has flown by, and in the next episode, episode 4, we will take a look at phase 2 and the future of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and where it leads. So for now, I will say farewell and bid you adieu. Take it easy, and I'll see you next time.